Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, privileged to be the president of the Urban Institute and to welcome you today. I see people are still joining us, but I think we'll get started. I want to thank you for being here on a special Earth Day edition of the Urban Institute's Evidence to Action. First, let me just do a quick set of housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded. The recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. All participants are muted, and we have closed caption turned on, but if you'd like to adjust your settings, click on the live transcription button at the bottom. We really would love to get your questions and comments into the question box at any time. We don't have much time, but even if we can't answer them, it's helpful for us and the panelists to see what you're thinking about, and it'll shape what we do in the future. And if you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Today's event is part of a series of discussions that Urban hosts with leading changemakers and policy analysts on questions emerging from the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, and our long overdue reckoning with our nation's ongoing structural racism. The increasing frequency and ferocity of extreme storms, heat, fire, and cold put millions at risk of facing a disaster each year. In the last 18 months, we've seen extreme storms upend the Texas power grid, raging wildfires in California, Oregon, and Washington, hurricanes pummeling the Gulf Coast, and temperatures matching the hottest year on record. Extreme environmental phenomena like these are physical events, but a disaster is what happens when these events affect communities, economies, and people, especially those with social vulnerabilities who typically suffer the most severe consequences from disasters. Those vulnerabilities limit a community's ability to protect themselves from, respond to, and rebuild after disasters have caused harm to their lives and their livelihoods. And those vulnerabilities sadly and inevitably intersect time and again with race, wealth, and immigration status. Today, many, though not all, disasters are related to the effects of global climate change. The new administration has named climate policy as one of their 4 pillars for economic recovery, along with equity. And their economic strategy for jobs and infrastructure plan focuses on climate resilience. So there's a great opportunity ahead in the context of these policy debates to center on equity as well as resilience, and to elevate evidence-based ideas that will help burdened and under-resourced communities be better prepared to protect against, prepare for, and respond to disasters. My urban colleagues have shown how communities of color face deeper and more long-lasting financial hits from disasters. And their research leads to policy recommendations to improve crucial disaster recovery tools, such as CDBG-DR, the Community Development Block Grant Program for Disaster Recovery. And you'll find links to these resources on the events page on our website, along with a link to Senator Schatz's bill that we'll discuss shortly. Our conversation today will build on this knowledge and the work of many, focused on the question of how federal government and others can enable a more just and equitable approach to disaster response, an approach that minimizes risk to underserved communities and prioritizes protection of the vulnerable people and places. And for this conversation, I am just thrilled that we'll be joined first today by Senator Brian Schatz. Welcome, Senator, from Hawaii, who also chairs the Senate Democrats Special Committee on the Climate Crisis, or did last year. Thank you for joining us, Senator.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to all your members for being on this Zoom. It is the work you do is really important. I've admired this organization for quite a long time.
No, thank you very much. And we're really pleased to have you here. Let's talk for a minute about how your constituents experience disasters. Just last month, the whole state saw massive floods that warranted a presidential declaration. And of course, Hawaiians live with the threat of volcano eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis. It's always back of mind. What does your state maybe appreciate about disasters that the rest of the country needs to understand?
Well, I'm not sure that we're any different than any other place in terms of disasters, except for the kind of tyranny of distance. When the federal government has to mobilize to provide assistance, they have to cross an ocean in order to do so. And so whatever takes time to do in terms of an administrative process just sort of adds a layer of delay. And so, you know, one of the things that we're working on in terms of the CDBG DR reform is to permanently authorize this program so that it doesn't have to sort of be set up as if we've never done it before, every single instance of a disaster, and to have a sort of standing program at HUD, rules already done, processes in place, so that the response can be as quick as possible in assisting the locals with disaster response and disaster recovery. Obviously, the volcanic eruption was unique even for Hawaii in terms of it destroying hundreds and hundreds of homes on Hawaii Island. The other thing I'll say is we've always been pleased with our federal partnerships. And so this is not to complain about FEMA or HUD or even the Department of Defense who comes to our aid when necessary as a training exercise, but just to understand that to the extent that we have statutes in place that cause delay unnecessarily, those statutes should be changed. And that's my end of the job.
And what I hear you saying also is that we should be ready for this because this is not a one and done event. We're going to be ongoing experience of disasters, almost certainly.
That's right. And I think it's, it's the way you fund it, right? Whether you provide permanent funding for this kind of thing and the way you operationalize it, both on the administrative side, but also on how you position assets in an era of climate change. Now, volcanic eruptions are an entirely different thing, but when you're talking about weather events, everybody understands that frequency and severity is going to go up. And so our capacity to respond should align with the new reality, as opposed to treating this like, well, who could have known that there was going to be another, series of wildfires and, in California, Arizona, and the Pacific Northwest. This is to be expected, and the government should not act surprised when it happens every year.
Well, in fact, I'm going to ask you about the bipartisan proposal for a national disaster safety board that you introduced last Congress, and I think intend to again soon, which is another piece, if you will, of an infrastructure of readiness for disasters. You, I think, have proposed, you can tell us, of an independent body modeled on what works for airline safety to provide constant learning from the federal response to the ongoing expectation of disasters. So we build that in. Can you describe your proposal? And if I might ask you to specifically focus on what elements of it will help us deal with the inequities in both disaster preparedness and outcomes.
Well, so this is about establishing best practices, right? This is as simple, and everybody understands NTSB comes in after a train crash or an airline event or whatever it is, and they're the authority. They do the after action analysis, and they may work with other agencies and even local government to determine what ought to happen going forward, but they really come in as an authority. When you're doing after action analysis and trying to do sort of continuous improvement or the standardization of best practices, right now, every disaster has its own after action process. Some are led by the locals, some, your regional FEMA administrator might be involved. It sort of is, I don't want to say haphazard, but certainly not uniform. And it may depend on whether the adjutant general is particularly engaged. It may depend on whether or not it happened in an area of political clout, right? And what we should have as a matter of law is this standard that every time there's a disaster, there's an analysis of what went wrong, right? Obviously, when you're talking about natural disasters, that part can't be prevented, but the response can always be improved, right? And the mitigation, both the hardening, but also the response in those moments can be improved. And this is about standardizing our response and making sure that to the extent that there are examples of ways to respond and recover from disasters better, that those best practices are shared with the entire country and don't depend on sort of individual leadership of a great mayor or a good FEMA administrator or the Red Cross in a particular town. This should be available to everybody. And what's great is we didn't have to, my staff who did really good work in this space didn't have to invent this because it already exists with NTSB. And that's why I think it's got good bipartisan support, because it just makes sense to treat disasters like disasters.
And is there a capacity in the proposal to look specifically at what kinds of places are most vulnerable and how we prepare and also mitigate that kind of harm?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is to assess vulnerabilities. I do think that's a bigger conversation throughout the federal government and state and county governments to assess vulnerabilities, because past we are past the point at which it's a theoretical question whether preparing for disasters costs more than responding to disasters. You can maybe make the argument 15 years ago that, maybe that was just a talking point, but now it's just like clearly more expensive to not be ready. And so we need to assess the vulnerability of specific communities. And I think about coastal inundation, I think about wildfires, I think about flooding that continues to happen, not quite in the exact same place every year, but certainly this stuff is becoming a little more predictable than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The modeling is getting more sophisticated and reliable, but maybe more importantly than that, we have real world data about where these disasters are occurring. And shame on us if we keep rebuilding the same place in the same way every 3 or 4 years with federal money. We need to figure out how to prepare for and make towns and cities and communities more resilient to disasters. And I think there's an important equity aspect of this where, I think of Waikiki in Honolulu, where you've got billions and billions of dollars of assets and coastal inundation. Well, I'm not actually as worried about Waikiki as I am about other places, because there's so much capital to protect in Waikiki that the owners of the hotels are going to figure out ways to make sure that the beach is still lovely. It's the other side of the island where you have rural folks, and they may or may not be wealthy, but they certainly don't have the amount of capital to protect that will make it worth it to them to do what is necessary to harden their shorelines or to do managed retreat. All of that stuff doesn't pencil out without the government coming in. And so I worry very much about places, the sort of apocalyptic stories around stuff happening to New York City and New Jersey and Hong Kong, right? And Honolulu. Well, they illustrate the risk around coastal flooding and storm surges and all that. But the truth is, those are the probably the only places on the planet that are going to have the money on their own to protect themselves. It's the other places that have the same coastal inundation, but no Manhattan to protect. And those people are going to get left out of this equation if we don't figure out how to do resilience on an equitable basis.
I often talk about the difference between Miami Beach and Homestead and make the same points in Florida. So I get your point exactly. Want to make sure we bring in a discussion of climate change while we have you here. As you mentioned earlier, the severity and frequency of certain kinds of disasters is a certainty at this point. For last year, you chaired the Special Democrats Committee on the Climate Crisis, and you did something that we noticed, especially, which is you set out to listen to people talking about the anticipated and real effects of climate from a broader group of people than we usually tend to hear from when we're talking about climate. So you talked to farmers and native tribal communities and labor and industry and a very diverse set of voices. What did you take away, not only about the extent of need, but about the diversity of need? And were there any common threads? And did any of that, how's that shape your thinking about this legislation and other proposals?
Yeah, we set about making sure that climate action was not just for people who care about, oceans and birds and squirrels and conservation, although I consider myself a conservationist, but rather an opportunity for all communities to rise economically. And so the first conversations we had were with organized labor and with native and tribal leaders to listen to them about how they wanted to participate in climate action. And, the short version is that the politics of climate have absolutely changed. Everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody understands that we don't have to make a choice between economic growth and climate action, that the best strategy for economic growth is in fact moving forward on climate and leading this revolutionary change and making sure nobody gets left behind. And so, yes, there are needs. Yes, it is urgent. Yes, it is terrifying. But I do think that part of what has changed around the politics is that, people tune out terrifying information. and people triage in their own minds what they're going to prioritize politically. And so we want to tell a story about American jobs. We want to tell a story about the restoration of communities, and we want to tell a story around including everybody in this climate action plan. And we've done I think we've done a really good job where the business community, organized labor, Native communities, frontline community, fence line communities are understanding that there's a real opportunity here, and that the Koch brothers really want us to have to choose between economic development and climate action. But the rest of the world understands that those things are, if not synonymous, then at least substantially overlapping.
I want to return you to the sort of question of environmental justice that is woven into thinking about disaster policy. You use the example of Waikiki Beach, and in essence, the investors and residents of Waikiki Beach are making a decision about whether they will mitigate in advance, whether they can build resilience to, whether they're going to move their investment capital somewhere else. But the residents on the other side of the island aren't really doing that intentional planning. They are affected by the consequences of these natural events, but then they essentially, things get happen to them. They don't have autonomy and the real agency in their choices. Is there a way that policy can help to empower people to be part of making the plans for their own communities and give them the resources to be resilient?
Yeah, I think it's two things. First, that's what government is for, right? Is to, especially when you're talking about infrastructure, it ought to be available to everybody, and not based on how much capital is being protected. It's about people. That's number one. And then number two is, as my friend and former colleague Barbara Mikulski used to say, nothing about me without me. And I really do think as we make policy, we need to understand that policy shouldn't happen to people, it should happen with people. And we should not assume that just because I'm the one in a tie in a big office that I actually have some sort of monopoly on what the next step should be. I've done a lot of studying, I do a lot of listening, I got a lot of great staff, but nothing about me without me.
So with that point in mind, let's talk about the agenda for the Congress. We have a new Congress now that we've had for the last few years, and we have a new administration. So what is sort of the policy agenda for the next 2 years? If you could set the agenda and what was going to be moving through the administrative and legislative processes, what would be top of mind in this area?
Well, I mean, it's a very broad question. I would just say, we have to move on all fronts. The traditional way to understand climate action is sort of in the regulatory space, but I think what President Biden has instructed his cabinet to do is, if you're in the State Department, that's got climate implications. If you're in HUD or the Department of Transportation, certainly the Department of Interior, even the Department of Defense, everybody's got a climate aspect to their job. And so I think on the administration side, it's a kind of broadening of the understanding of what climate action is. The other thing I'll say is that I think, we have our biggest opportunity to take climate action this calendar year, this legislative session. But B, this is a generational crisis. And so this is not the kind of thing where you pass a bill and then you move on from it. We're going to have to, in order to effectuate this change, we really should think of this as a generational effort. And it's going to happen with multiple pieces of legislation, state, federal, county, international agreements, private sector participation. I mean, this is a whole of society effort that's got to last for decades. It's not like we're going to pass a bill and say, great, we fixed it.
And one of the things that we're very excited about at Urban is the same all of government approach that is all policy is climate, also is all policy is equity. And each choice, we should be thinking about the consequences for our planet and thinking about the consequences for those least among us. We are grateful to you for your efforts in this area, and especially for sharing them with us today. And we enjoy working with your staff very much. Thank you, Senator, for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Take care. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists for a discussion of these and other issues. I will be joined shortly by, first of all, Carlos Martín, who is a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute. Carlos leads Urban's disaster and climate response, or I guess I should say climate and disaster response research and policy portfolio. We also have Zoe Middleton. She is the Houston and Southeast Texas co-director of Texas Housers, which is a group working to support low-income Texans' efforts to access decent, affordable homes in quality neighborhoods of their choice. Finally, we have our friend Sarah Saadian, who is the Vice President of Public Policy for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. So Zoe, Sarah, Carlos, thank you very much. Very excited to have you. And my goal for this part of the discussion is to try to explore what power the federal government has, as well as local jurisdictions, to make our existing disaster preparedness and response mechanisms serve all of our communities more equitably. So let me start with you, Carlos. The senator spoke of ways in which disasters exacerbate some of the inequities faced by underserved communities and their sort of lack of voice and agency in planning and preparing for that. So what do we know from the evidence about the extent of inequities? And as these disasters grow more frequent, what risks in particular do our overburdened and under-resourced communities face?
Sure. I mean, even just looking at the point of a hazard event and what happens in the aftermath of that, we see huge disparities right from the beginning. Just looking back at the death toll, and for example, in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria going up beyond the 3,000 point, and debates about even basic information about the relief and response information that occurred in some of these disasters is already the first point in which we could talk about how these disparities start playing out. 500,000 Oregonians were evacuated, and one can easily start pointing out which those populations are. But this isn't just in the short term after these events happen. These disparities start playing themselves out much more strongly over a longer term a time. I mean, if you think about the financial effects of a hazard, we know that any financial shock to a household creates a spiral. Disasters definitely follow that same model. In our studies at the Urban Institute, what we've shown is that there's at least a 5 percentage point decrease in households in their debt, in their credit scores 1 year after the disaster, and then by the fourth year, it's up to 10 points. Percentage points decrease. For people living in communities of color, it's even worse, with an average 31 point score decline by the fourth year compared to a 4-point decline in majority white communities. So you could just see longer term effects, not just on the obvious physical health and mortality disparities that we see, but then in the financial effects and employment effects, children's education, certainly housing effects, which is near and dear to our hearts at Urban Institute, and then the effects of people who have to then migrate after that. These are ongoing problems that unfortunately aid doesn't necessarily address in the longer term, because so many of these communities slip through the cracks.
So Zoe, you work in Houston and Southeast Texas, epicenter in recent years of some disaster events. You had intense flooding during Hurricane Harvey. You had this winter's deep freeze that tested, I would say, even exploded the capacity of Texas's power grid. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on one particular community in these disasters and how different parts of the population have fared?
Yeah, I think the best way to talk about the disparate impact of disasters, and we have disasters that are not just climate crises and grid failures. We also have a lot of chemical disasters being the center of the oil and gas industry in the States. But I would say that one group that kind of exemplifies all of the challenges and disparate impacts of disaster are renters. We know already that Black and Latino households are twice as likely to rent their homes than own them because of a pre-existing history of redlining and denial of access to credit and the racial wealth gap, which we know disasters only make larger. And we see that policy really isn't prepared for them or prepared to help them recover even partway whole. So on a state level, you do not have to be told when you are looking to rent a house or an apartment whether or not your structure has flooded before. Homeowners are given the luxury of that information, and that's a House bill that we have right now that didn't succeed the last time around in the Texas state legislature, even after Harvey. And we have neighborhoods that are subject to this really unfair FEMA verified, not FEMA verified loss, that's everyone that's a renter, but the Army Corps of Engineer match based on for infrastructure projects. And so a lot of the communities that we work with in Northeast Houston have had infrastructure denied to them precisely because the home and property values are too low. So we see, based on where you are and based on your type of housing tenure, that more people are falling through the cracks with each disaster.
Thanks for sharing that. So Sarah, we're going to start talking about probably an alphabet soup of federal programs in a minute, but can you start us off, make sure we're all at the same level here, with a quick overview of how federal disaster relief works?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I start, I just want to say I'm so pleased to be on this panel with Zoe and Carlos. Both of them are extremely great thought leaders in this. They've been doing incredible work, and I'm just happy to be at the same table with them. But when there's a disaster, we see this process happening both at the state and local level and at the federal level. And usually where the federal government comes in is after a governor makes a request to the president to declare a major disaster and to set off to activate a series of programs. Those programs happen across federal agencies at FEMA, HUD, Small Business Administration, USDA, and others. So you can see even just from that, it's a very complicated process. It's one with overlapping jurisdictions and authorities that helps to make this a really difficult challenge to solve. Some of the biggest programs that people use after disaster is FEMA's Public Assistance Program, which is used to reimburse states and localities for building infrastructure and addressing the needs in government buildings, for example. FEMA also approves individual assistance, which provides financial assistance and housing assistance to survivors, and also replacement and repair services for people who are rebuilding their homes after disaster. In the longer term, we have the CDBG-DR program, which you mentioned with Senator Schatz earlier. That's a really flexible source of funds that state and local governments use to address their long-term recovery needs. So it can be used, again, to support small businesses, to rebuild infrastructure, to help address housing needs. But it's not an authorized program, which also adds to some of the confusion and delays in getting those funds out the door. And then lastly, I'll just touch on some mitigation programs. So these are programs that are looking more forward-looking than to the typical disaster response and recovery programs. These are ones that are really geared towards trying to build up communities and their capacity so that they're more resilient for the next disaster down the road.
So the sort of panoply of programs that you've described, I think, are generally designed to come in and whoever you are, whatever impact you're facing, there's assistance. I have not experienced, tell me if you agree, that these programs were designed with much intentionality about the fact that different people were at different capacity in the first place to be resistant, let alone to recover from these events. And in some ways, when there are existing inequalities and something like this happens, the problems, the recovery programs can sometimes even inadvertently or not exacerbate those inequalities. Can you talk a little bit about that mechanism and what are we trying to disrupt here if we're trying to have a new focus on equity?
Yeah, absolutely. So through our work with the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition of about 850 organizations, many of whom have gone through firsthand with recovering after disaster, we've really come to the conclusion that our federal disaster housing response is fundamentally broken and leads to greater inequities at every stage in the process. So just to give a couple examples of that, we know that in the emergency planning and response part of a disaster response, we see that planning tends to focus on able-bodied middle-class households who have significant resources that can sustain them during evacuation, for example. We see people who are experiencing homelessness, who are segregated from other households, unable to receive the same assistance as renters, for example. We see that communications are often only provided in English, even in Puerto Rico, where it's a Spanish-speaking area, right? We still saw communications go out primarily in English. And we still see continually this is a habitual issue where people with disabilities are not a part of the process of planning and are 2 to 4 times more likely to die as a result from the disaster. So their needs aren't being taken into consideration in the planning process. In terms of the short-term recovery, I think this is the place where we've probably focused the most as an organization, trying to make sure that the lowest income and most marginalized survivors have access to these FEMA resources, which can be really life-saving if people are able to access it. But again, what we found is that the programs are designed with middle-class white households in mind and not those who have the greatest needs. And so we see FEMA eligibility standards that are very narrowly tailored. We see lengthy and confusing application processes and appeals processes, all of which means that low-income people end up not applying for assistance or not making it through that application process, or they're denied at much higher rates. And that has downstream effects too. So that means not only are those individuals not able to get the immediate assistance that they need, but those data points are used later on in the recovery process to make really important decisions about how resources are allocated. I'll also just mention, if it's okay, of housing programs specifically, because as Carlos mentioned, that's really very central to the work that we've been doing and that he's been looking at as well. What we see is that FEMA typically relies on programs that are inaccessible to low-income people. So the TSA hotel program is one that is used to house survivors after disaster, but low-income people are required to pay daily fees or put down security deposits or credit cards when they're trying to access those TSA programs. And so it means that low-income people who are unbanked or underbanked can't have access to that really life-saving form of housing. And in the place of, instead of, while relying, I'd say, on that program, FEMA has, over the last several years, refused to activate better programs that are more tailored to the needs of marginalized people, like the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, which is modeled after Section 8 Housing Choice Vouchers, a proven solution that we know really works well with people who have the very lowest incomes. So we're seeing this disparity where the programs that could be serving low-income people aren't being used, and the programs that are really geared towards middle-class families are the ones that are being prioritized.
So Carlos, you just heard a couple examples of places that are starting to try to think about better practices. You've been studying this work as tribes, cities, and states have been trying to reimagine their planning and preparedness processes. Are there some good examples and lessons that we can learn from these new approaches?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is states and localities have really had no choice but to move forward on their own, not just after disasters, but even before. And that is the critical issue that we're trying to address. I mean, let's keep in mind that I always use this, and it bears repeating, that historically the federal government has spent 1/16 on mitigation of hazards as compared to the recovery after the disaster. So much of what we can do, certainly in terms of disaster repair, relief response and recovery, and addressing with the equitable access issues as Sarah has described, but also dealing with the core racial income disparities that existed before that need to be addressed. So let me give some examples. So I said states and localities are the ones who are bearing the burden of this. As our colleagues in our Tax Policy Center at Urban Institute would note, 96% of national capital investments are funded by state and local governments, not by the federal government. 92% of that is public safety, like flood protections. So there are some places that are looking at how they can expand the financing of mitigation. So there is a bond act that's being reposted to vote in November 22 for New York State, the Environmental Bond Act, which had been pulled out during the pandemic. The Miami Forever Bond in 2017 passed. The Houston Harris County Stormwater District passed in bond in 2018 after Harvey. So these are really important critical issues for state and localities about how they can pay for these things. The one, I guess, additional thing I'd want to say around this is most of that disaster mitigation and climate adaptation funding is going to large scale infrastructure, and less is going to community level, neighborhood level mitigation, housing level mitigation, and certainly less to social programming. And that's a huge loss because doing the infrastructure projects are helpful and they're certainly needed, but there's certainly a lot more that needs to happen, including prioritizing low and moderate income and communities of color within those communities.
So Zoe, I want to turn back to you. We've been talking a lot here about getting folks ready and dealing with the immediate response and in some cases work in advance, but also let's talk about rebuilding. You know, when a community affected has reflected past segregation, concentration, and inequities, how do we avoid simply rebuilding back those same challenges, that same isolation, the same lack of rich communities of opportunity?
I think a lot of this conversation so far presumes that, like, for low income, Black and brown, undocumented, disabled folks, that we're not already living in a failed state, and that the ways in which the state has operated in the past are simply going to continue to work, and we can throw a social vulnerability index at it and solve the problem. And that's simply not enough. You need to have, in addition to the quantitative data to tells you where to go and who to worry about, you also need to have the people who have experienced it at the table. And so in Texas, we have started to do these, advisory boards for mitigation funds, and I think that's great. But really, it helps if policymakers are making good policy before there's ever a crisis, and propping up their own local safety nets. So, during COVID-19, Houston has had 27,000 eviction filings and no grace period. And someone from Southeast Louisiana was recently displaced, and I saw her in an eviction courtroom just the other week. And because we don't have any kind of a grace period, because we don't have a moratorium, this one was at risk of, while being displaced from one climate disaster this summer with Laura, was at risk of losing her temporary housing in Houston that was supposed to be paid for by FEMA. And that wouldn't have happened if we had had decent, strong local protections, or if we ever invited survivors to the table at the first place to learn what is needed for people to move into areas of opportunity, to move into more stability. People like that woman are not considered in planning, and the only way we hear their voices is if we happen to be sitting around watching eviction court. And that's simply unfair, and there's no need to continue to proceed with that method of creating and designing programs.
So Sarah, there is something about this moment after the year that our country has had, in which people are talking about solutions that are sort of bigger than we've tended to talk about. It's not just the next incremental legislative reform or regulatory action. So when it comes to sort of climate change and its effects, when it comes to disaster policy, if you could think big, what would be the sort of larger approach and your most ambitious agenda?
Yeah, so that's a great question. About a year and a half ago, our organization pulled together a convening with about 70 of our closest partners working on disaster recovery to do exactly that, to rethink a broken system and how would we center it on the needs of people who have the greatest needs. And we came around with 7 or so basic fundamental principles that have to be in place for any disaster recovery that I think are fundamentally missing from the existing system, but need to be included. So things like really robust resident participation and engagement in decision-making, to Zoe's point about having people at the table with lived experience. We need systemic transparency. So a lot of the times FEMA makes decisions, but really basic information about program eligibility, program rules, how do you apply, how do you appeal, that's not made publicly available. And so people are operating in the dark, and we need a much more robust system for making sure that that's a systematic way of providing transparency. We need full accountability and due process. And by that, we mean shared information reported monthly about who's receiving resources and who is not, disaggregated by race and other protected classes. So we can do an analysis to make sure, are these programs contributing to racial equity or are they working against it? And right now we don't have any sort of way of systematically looking at and analyzing programs to make sure that that's happening. We also need greater enforcement of fair housing rights and civil rights. Zoe and her organization have really made the point that if we're building back the same way that we were before, we're just rebuilding back Jim Crow segregation, and we need to have a very purposeful use of federal dollars to make sure that we're undoing racial segregation at the same time that we're building back from disasters. And then finally, having a more robust way of ensuring that jobs and that job creation that's happening as a result of the rebuilding process is going to low-income people and people in their communities so that they can not only be more resilient for themselves, they're learning new skills, we're putting those skills to work so that they can earn more money, but building their communities and building the wealth within their communities.
If I could, Sarah, if there's a document that summarizes those, we'll add it to the website that with the other materials that we've provided. That sounds like a good summary. What I hear you saying is it's not simply about another new program and another law. It's really about a different approach to how we think about each and every one of our policy programs in the disaster context. So Zoe and Carlos, I'm going to give you one last bite at this apple. You're thinking about, you're getting to think big. What is one thing you would add to the agenda that Sarah's at, or something you want to reinforce? Carlos, you can, all right, Zoe?
I'd rather have him or Zoe first.
There are two things that I would like, so I'm going to cheat. First is eliminating non-disclosure agreements that are signed by FEMA inspectors during their very, very quick training in hotel conference rooms before they are deployed to disaster zones. I think that those NDAs really make it harder for us to understand, or harder for the inspectors to come forward, and harder for people like myself and Carlos and Sarah to understand just how and where people are falling through the cracks. I can't tell you how many people call me and want to have a very long conversation one time about discrimination in FEMA programs, and then you can never hear from them again. And then I'd also say, which we've gotten some promising news today, is the reform of opportunity zones programming so that they don't speed up climate gentrification, which we know that they're bound to do. 95% of Puerto Rico is an opportunity zone. A lot of areas that are just outside bad floodplains at Houston and close to downtown are opportunity zones. So I think that those two reforms could be pretty powerful.
Carlos, close us out.
Zoe, I'm going to cheat too. So I feel like one, just to follow up on the detailing the ways that people slip through the cracks after disaster is absolutely critical to be able to fix the system. And I think Sarah's report, that disaster housing recovery report, certainly gets us there, but we have to push that even more. And looking at not just the typical focus on property that our disaster management system has, but on people is the bigger issue that I want to make sure that we're addressing. And that includes people before the mitigation, before the disaster happens. As Zoe mentioned, the system is broken, not just the emergency management system in terms of our crisis orientation, but also the fact that we're not including people in decisions about where are viable places to live and what are the reparations that need to happen to make sure that every community is viable, every person is viable, I should say. So those are my 2 points.
And I heard in there a very Urban Institute-like call for a data infrastructure and transparency, because that is empowering to give people the ability to make the case for what's needed. And we're always keen on more robust data infrastructure here to help serve people and places. So let me just say thank you to Zoe, to Sarah, to Carlos, to the Senator for being with us. And thanks everyone for joining us. See us back here at Evidence to Action. Take care.